All right, so you just heard, as chosen by my fellow panelists, London's Burning. I might have picked White Riot, guys. Might have been my pick, but that was a pretty good pick along the way, so can't complain with your choices. Are you ready to go in a bio of The Clash? Because we're going to cover The Clash multiple times, so I'm going to just cover the early stages of The Clash and then kind of feed in bits and pieces along the way.
Okay. I'm going to give you some numbers first, though, John.
That would be awesome if you give us some numbers first.
So the debut album, self-titled album, The Clash, coming in at number 65 in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums, number 9 in 1977, number 263 of all time. It's The Clash's second highest-rated album on Best Ever Albums, behind London Calling, and on Rolling Stone's list, it comes in at number 102 of all time.
Excellent. Well, here's the fascinating thing about The Clash, guys. I don't know if there is a band that was formed and then became huge in a quicker period of time than The Clash. It's the time frame for them is remarkable. So let's give a little bit of context right here, because they were young men as well. I think there's a clip at some point that the other members of The Clash, especially Paul Simon and thought that Joe Strummer was a little bit old for the rest of them, and I think he was all of 22 years old when he joined the band.
His name's Paul Simon?
Paul Simonon is the name.
Simonon. I thought it was like Paul Simon.
Paul Simonon is the name of the bassist. So that actually is a nice thing. So formed in 1976. As you guys might know, The Clash have many claim to fame, but probably what they are best known for is being a true genre bender in different sounds. Mm-hmm. So reggae, dub, funk, ska, rockabilly, traditional rock and roll. I mean, they're kind of delving into everything. I would say, though, that this album doesn't have the level of variety that some of the later ones would have. It's still present all over the place, but there's definitely more of a punk influence on this album than there maybe is on future Clash albums. The members, for those that don't know, at least in terms of the classic lineup, and 3 of the 4 members of the classic lineup are going to be on this album. Only drummer Nicky Topper Hedden is not on this album. He actually comes in for album number 2, Give Him Enough Rope. He comes in actually basically right after this album is recorded. The drummer on this album is Terry Chimes, who's the original drummer. The rest of the band, who is on all of their albums until the Cut the Crap album at the end, and which kind of is like Zombie Clash, is Joe Strummer, who's on vocals on most songs and rhythm guitar, Mick Jones, who's the other vocalist, who's also on lead guitar, and Paul Simonon, who we just talked about, who's on bass. And yeah, the 2 different drummers, this one Terry Chimes, and for future ones Topper Hedden. Hedden's with the band all the way until 1982, when he leaves due to a heroin addiction, so he is somewhat and somewhat not on the Clash's second to last album, Combat Rock, which I think is probably best known for having Rock the Casbah on it, among others, but that's probably, well, Should I Stay or Should I Go is on that one too. That's a pretty big song as well. And then Mick Jones actually leaves the band in 1983 as well. The band completely disbanded in early 1986. That run includes 6 total albums between 1977 and 1985. There are 3 of them in the 70s. We're going to cover 2 of them. This one, the debut, Give 'Em Enough Rope, which we are not scheduled to cover, and then London Calling, which we will be covering. I believe we also cover Sandinista in the 80s. So we will end up doing, well, I was going to say
that'll
3
take a
albums,
while.
but between Sandinista and London's Calling, it's basically the equivalent of 4 additional albums, because a double album and a triple album there. So here's the band's origin story. The band I described it as the band started out as loose parts in the London music scene. So you've got Joe Strummer kind of in his own world. He's for those that don't know, Joe Strummer, and why would you if you're not a Clash enthusiast? He was born John Graham Meller, and he was a member of the band the 101ers, which formed in 1974. Strummer's name was a reference to his less than expert skills on the ukulele that he used to play when he busked in the London Underground, which, for those that don't know, the London Underground is the subway station. So it's like saying the London subway station. So you got Joe Strummer kind of doing that between 1974 and 1976. Then you've got Mick Jones, who, for the sake of this analogy, if we're going the Pink Floyd route, right, he's sort of like the Roger Waters of the Clash in terms of role, right? Creative spark. There's another person in Joe Strummer who's considered to be the preferred member for some folks, right? But most people say the engine was Mick Jones. He's a guitarist for the proto-punk band London SS. The thing I found most interesting about London SS, there's two things. One is that Terry Chimes and Paul Simon both tried out for London SS but did not make it. And Topper Header, the drummer later, was a member for a week before he quit. So they all were in the realm of this band, right? But they were, the exception of Topper Header for a week, they were not in it. The other thing that's funny is they rehearsed for the entirety of 1975, but they made a demo tape and never played a live show. So they were just, this band was just basically playing and honing their craft.
They were a garage town.
So yeah, exactly. So during this time, the most important thing I think of London SS, besides maybe introducing, him to those folks sort of by proxy, is that Jones and that band, London SS, is managed by a gentleman by the name of Bernard Rhodes, who ends up becoming the Clash's manager as well. Bernard Rhodes was an associate of Malcolm McLaren, who, I don't know how familiar you guys are, but he was basically the Svengali type figure behind the Sex Pistols, right? He basically created the Sex Pistols, among other. He also had a famous stint with the New York Dolls, right, where he reinvented them and it didn't go so well. And then the Sex Pistols were like Bite of the Apple #2. So because he's friends with Malcolm McLaren, he's got a little bit of juice, and Mick Jones actually becomes friends with two members of the Sex Pistols. Hilariously, probably the two members of the Sex Pistols you can't name if you're like a person on the outside. So, because I think most people would name Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten, right? It's the other two members of the band.
And Joe Pistol.
Yeah, that's also not who he knew here. Yeah, so.
And Mike Uzi.
Well, you guys could just keep naming random people, but those are none of the people that Mick Jones was friends with. So this is happening. Joe Strummer's doing his thing. This London SS is there, and then there's different people around there. So Jones goes and actually sees the Sex Pistols in concert, hence these connections, right? He immediately kind of figures out, and this is before the Sex Pistols like break as the Sex Pistols, right? They're still in the ether and as the Clash or not. It's important to know that like the timeline from when this happens to like when the Clash are signing a massive deal with CBS Records is like under a year. So it's going to be breakneck speed here. So Jones goes see the Sex Pistols, and he immediately it's like the zeitgeist, right? He sees it. He's like, this sound, this aesthetic, this is like the next music, right? In London. He's like, I have no doubt about this. This is what it is. So he starts trying to put together a band to play some of this sound, but also get some of the feel aesthetically for the band. And that takes him to Simonon, who is sort of was considered sort of a cool guy, you know what I mean, had a vibe to him and stuff. And Rhodes sort of says, you should bring this Paul Simonon back. The only problem is he was not so good at instruments, right? So he says, we need you to learn an instrument if you're going to be in this band. Which,
give him the bass.
It's punk, you know what I mean? So it's the bass and it's punk, right? And the joke about punk is that every punk band thing starts with, well, we wanted to start a band, but we didn't know how to play instruments, so we made a punk band. Which there's a ha-ha to it. Of course, these bands, it's not about virtuoso playing, I think, is what that kind of gets to the heart of. So, yeah, so they put a bass in his hand, and Simonon becomes the bassist. And so Chimes, who's back in the picture here, the original drummer, and Mick Jones and a gentleman by the name of Keith Levine start rehearsing, but the band does not really have a featured lead singer. Enter Joe Strummer, who Rhodes also is able to connect to them. So Rhodes is responsible for bringing Simonon in the fold and Strummer in the fold. He's given a 48-hour ultimatum to join the band, and 24 hours later, he agrees. So we now have a 5-piece Clash. That will be important in a couple months here. This is considered where the Clash started. Simonon gives them their name when he's just reading the newspaper and he sees the word Clash in a bunch of different stories and says, that stands out. Takes it to them as the Clash, and they say, sounds like a good name, and they run with it. So there you go. Origin story of the Clash right there. The band plays their first gig on July 4th, 1976, opening for the Sex Pistols in Sheffield. So their first gig is there. It should also give you sort of an idea of how quickly this scene was moving, by the way. That, the Clash are just these guys, around the scene, right? And the Sex Pistols at this point are still just a scenester band, right? This is July 4th, 1976. The year of punk in Great Britain is 1977.
So John, just to stop for a minute, like, this is what we think of as like the modern punk in a sense, or like the rise of it.
New York City is where punk is starting, because the Ramones are already out there doing it, but they're in 76, right? So that's where we're at. Right around now, the Ramones are starting to get a name for themselves, and the English bands like the Sex Pistols and the Buzzcocks and the Damned, right, and the Clash, they are all forming and quickly playing. So they are in this, and this is actually going to, by the way, be something that happens multiple times in England in the late 70s and the early 80s, because there's a bunch of different new romantic, ska, all kinds of that become these scenes that, like, they go from 0 to 60, right? And they become the thing in England. When we get to ska stuff, I'll be able to tie all this stuff together, because you kind of, I don't mean to tangent too. England had an interesting subculture where things like being a mod or being a skinhead was like a real thing. Like, not like how we think of it, like, oh, it's kind of like how you dress. It was like a whole identity, right? And a whole, almost like we think of like with hardcore or something in, you're a straight edge, right, in the United States, but they had all of these different subsects, and all of these subsects got like violent with each other. So it's a whole bizarre subculture that doesn't really have an American kind of easy comparison.
We kind of talked about that with the mods versus the rockers and the Who and stuff like that.
Well, and you have to understand the late 70s is a response to that late 60s. Like there's the late, and some of it is like revivalist, so they bring revival back of stuff like that. So we'll get there eventually. I don't think this is the conversation to have it, and maybe when we get to the Sex Pistols, I'll cover it there.
So are they thought of as fads also because they rise so quickly? Do they like disappear as quickly too, or do attitudes change, I guess?
I mean, the punk sound is the first of those fads, I think, in the late 70s, and it becomes sort of the baseline for that's why you've got post-punk, right? And new romantic is a reaction to that. So I think in some ways it's considered less of a fad because it becomes the standard by which all of the other and you also have to understand these subcultures persist way after the mainstream popularity of them is there. They're still very much selling albums, but we'll get there. I don't think this is the time to go into that. I promise to revisit that topic, but there's so much of the Clash year. I kind of want to just get into the openings of this scene. So they play their first gig on the 4th of July, but in England, that has a very different meaning than 1976.
More of American aggression.
They get there, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And they don't play again for 5 weeks. Rhodes kind of says to them, you guys need to get tighter because in his mind, they're a little bit loose. It is their first gig after all. They take those 5 weeks, and by all accounts, they come back. And like, not only are they better, but like they're like basically the sound that you're hearing on this album. Like that's what the growth was in that area. Wow. So that's they said they played like almost like with like the fervor of like monks and stuff in terms of discipline, or over that time is I think the quote that Joe Strummer might have said along the way. So keep in mind their first gig is July 4th, 1976. They then, by August 29th, they're actually on a 3-act show with the Sex Pistols and the Buzzcocks. And that is a show that's a pretty infamous show because that's considered to be like the beginning of that runaway train of British punk going from like marginalized, I shouldn't say marginalized, niche, right? Yeah. Niche. But it's hard to even call it a niche though because like it didn't exist like a year ahead of this. And then it was there, it kind of germinated out of nowhere. This happened in August 29, and to give you an idea of how quickly it explodes, right? By January 25th of 1977, the Clash have signed to CBS Records for £100,000 in 1977. They'd played a total of 30 gigs with almost none of them as a headliner.
Mm-hmm.
And they signed a deal for £100,000. The good news is that was a lot of money. The bad news is the deal outside of that was the shits. And basically it was described by one band associate as, the deal was later used as a classic example of the kind of contract that no group should ever sign. The group had to pay for their own tours, recordings, remixes, artwork, expenses, everything.
Wow.
So basically everything the Clash did outside of that $100,000 advance was basically out of their own pocket. You don't see it on this album, but I'll give you a hint, guys. In future albums, that comes up as song topics. Most notably, how Sandinista was a thing. I don't know if, we joked earlier that Sandinista was a 3-disc album, right, and a little bit bloated. Often not covered is the fact that when the Clash recorded Sandinista, I'll give you a guess as to how many albums they had left on their record contract.
3.
You got it. So I'll give you a hint as to what their play was with that. We're going to record all 3 of them at the same time, and now our record album is done. Mm-hmm. So that'll be part of the discussion we have on Sandinista. But yeah, so a little bit of context right there. In between their first gig on July 4th, 1976, and them signing that deal on January 25th, 1977, Levine is fired from the band. They say because of a speed addiction. He contradicts that, but I don't know, man. I think sometimes... if everybody says you have a speed addiction except for you, my guess is you probably have a speed addiction, right?
Yeah.
And so Levine is gone, so they're down to a 4-piece. And Chimes actually leaves the band shortly after this album is recorded. He's considered to be a member of the band, and he plays on the album, but by the time they are doing the album art, you may notice there's only 3 members of the Clash on the cover. That is because he basically voluntarily pulled himself from the album because he knew he was going in a different direction, and it was basically described as like an artistic difference. Like they wanted to do one thing, he wanted to do something different. Apparently, there wasn't too much hard feelings because he actually was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with them. So the original 4 and him.
And he only played on this album.
And in terms of their studio albums, yes, he only played on this album and some of those 30 gigs. But yes, he went in with them.
That's interesting too, because that's not just the band's call; that's also the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's call as to which members of the band are going to be inducted when you have multiple members. So, I think that actually comes more from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame than it does actually the band.
There you go. So they decided he was worthy, so he's in there. White Riot. From this is released as a single in March 1977 and gets to number 34 in England. And then this album, The Clash, comes out a month later. So if you put the timeline together, guys, if you see it, this album comes out in April of 1977, and they played their first gig on July 4th, 1976. So this album is the result of... And remember, that was when the album was released. So this album is basically recorded 6 to 7 months into the band's history. And it was recorded for a total of £4,000. So another one of these albums that was recorded for a ridiculously low amount of money.
Yeah.
It was successful from the jump. It reached number 12 in the UK. And critics did love this album. As a matter of fact, sort of the... London Calling is the Clash's best album. I'm not going to say it was totally retconned because it was received extremely well as well, but that was a real discussion in the early stages whether that one or this album was the one that was most well received. There's glowing praise about this album everywhere you look. I won't read it, but needless to say, there weren't many people challenging that point of view. It was pretty much the mainstream view. It actually, the record company, CBS Records, did not release this in the United States until 1979. They believed it was too raw and too underproduced to make it marketable here, which is hilarious because they clearly were not picking up on the whole, Ramones, the 70s ethos that was going on. The North American version was finally released in the U.S. in 1979 with a modified track listing. Basically, 10 of the 14 songs here are on that one, and then there are 5 different songs, and then a different version of White Riot is on that album. So, interestingly enough, many of the songs that were left off of it and put on the US one were singles, and were all pretty big hits. So it would kind of be like if the Beatles released another version, and they did, right? They would have US and UK, but if they took like 4 of their massive non-album singles and just tack them on to like I don't know, Please Please Me or something, Matt. That would be kind of the equivalent of it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and like I said, Hedden does not come into the band until shortly after this album. So he is actually not the drummer on this album if you're listening to it. I'm going to stop there because we'll be revisiting The Clash multiple different times in the future, and I'll string some stuff along. That's a little bit of a primer on The Clash. You know what, Josh? We'll start with you this time. Thoughts on self-titled album, debut, The Clash?
Well, it's quite a debut album, right? It's remarkable how this basically, like we said, paves the way for all future punk rock. You can see the blueprint here with not just the sound, but the energy behind it, the kind of raw power of them, the enthusiasm that comes through, the social commentary that's a big part of the punk aesthetic and sound and the lyrics and stuff. And so many bands I listened to as a teenager just kind of sprung from this. I can hear it in just like chords or like things they do with the drum or like bass lines. It just like kind of sparks a memory in me when I was listening to this album. I think it's a great debut. I think I like later Clash albums a bit more, or I think their sound kind of matures and develops a bit more. But Janie Jones is such a great opening track. It just sets the tone for the whole album. The other good thing that they're really good with is, well, besides songs being short and to the point, they have a great writing of choruses and making catchy choruses. I think that's why Matt and I both wanted London's Burning in the opening partly. That's one of the catchier songs on this album. And it's pretty much a storyline about a snapshot of, dissatisfaction with the UK, I would say, based on the lyrics in the songs, or if not dissatisfaction, then like a snapshot of life at that time for them and where they were in London. I love the punk sound, so I'm kind of like predisposed to liking The Clash. I think if you're any sort of punk fan, you always go back to kind of those bands that John named and from the UK and the US. I also like, we don't, like John said, we kind of get an introduction of them bringing reggae into their songs with Police and Thieves in this. I'd like more of that on this album. I think that comes later. I think they're just kind of dipping their toes in, and I like when they branch out more and integrate those other genres into their songs. I think that's what makes them special. Standout songs for me are Janie Jones, I'm So Bored with the USA, because I'm also so bored with the USA. I'm over it, man. And Police and Thieves, I think it is their longest song, but I think it's one of my favorite songs on the album. I mean, I really like that integration of reggae and punk that they do on that. What else to say about them? I think those are kind of my initial thoughts. I don't think I had heard this album in a long time, or don't ever. It's always one of those cases where you go to London Calling or you play those singles, and I haven't listened to the album straight through in a while. I will say it's a little, I don't want to say samey, but you kind of get the idea of what they're going for, probably like more than halfway through. And I think they provide just enough variety in the songs to make it a fun, easy listen. But I think when they start incorporating those genres more, they kind of fill out or deepen the album as a whole on later albums. What about you, Matt? What did you...
So I didn't know any of these songs or this album at all, except actually I did know Police and Thieves. My superfan Kevin, I believe, put that on a mix for me once.
Did you know the Clash at like all growing up, or like what was kind of your...
I knew the singles probably.
Yeah.
And I did get London Calling, oh God, probably like 15 years ago. So I do know that album. So I love this. This is a real fun album. It was very it's certainly punk, and I love Joe Strummer's voice. I believe, is he the main singer behind this, the lead singer for a lot of these songs?
He sings the vast majority of the songs. Yeah.
So I love it's attitude, man. He is just attitude, and like this is a total great example of why I don't care about lyrics, because there's no way I could understand what he was saying, even if I was trying to pay attention to what he was saying, because it's just the vocals here. Just a great example of why I view that as another instrument, essentially, and he sounds great. He's this punk attitude is just palpable on this record, and it's the energy. That's the other thing too. Very energetic, fast, a lot of staccato playing. But behind a lot of these songs is also like there's melody. Like Remote Control, I'm So Bored of the USA. I mean, these songs there's melodic parts thrown in there that I wouldn't say it's quite what pop punk became later on, like in the 90s and 2000s, like with Blink-182 and Green Day and The Offspring, that are very much, they're rooted in punk, but they're also they're way more melodic than this. This is a rawer sound, but you're still getting a little piece. You're getting some pieces of of those melodies, of the melodic nature of this music in this album. So, just really liked it. I see what you're saying, Josh. It's a little samey. I think Police and Thieves is the only one that stands out, and I'm seeing here that was a cover, so that totally makes sense that this is, not that wasn't what they were writing at this time. But I don't mind it, right? If you're going to be samey and you're going to sound like this, go for it, because it's just such a it's just such a fun listen, and it's not terribly long, and I think that there's enough here that that kind of to differentiate from one song to the next, that I don't feel like I don't get bored at all. This is just pops right in the beginning all the way through, very energetic, angry, kind of. It's I could see why this took off, because even though this wasn't a huge thing back in the mid 70s, we were seeing some things being laid here and there with bands like obviously the Stooges, that were throwing some of this down. We covered Wire, but Wire wasn't, I guess they weren't a very big band, but there were bands that were doing similar things, or harder music or faster music, and it just this seems like it was kind of like a lightning in the bottle type moment, from 76, 77, when you've got Ramones, these guys, the Sex Pistols, that just kind of blew up and just changed, and influenced so many people. And so this was great. This was a real fun listen. And I'm trying to remember like my listening experience with London Calling, which I do like. I remember that being long, and I wasn't sure if that's because that's how long the album is, or if that's because you said it was a double album, John, London Calling?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I'm interested to hear that, Jux, but you're right. There's a lot more variety there, and you're not really, this is just raw, punk music, right. And it's great. So I liked it a lot.
So, I mean, this is a seminal album in my music life. Mm-hmm. I heard this, I think, for the first time when I was 12 years old. It was this specific album.
This must have been mind-blowing at that age.
Oh, it was. I can't, like, I think there's a narrative with The Clash now that's been built that doesn't ever strike me as authentic, and I wonder how much people like or even listen to The Clash. It's sort of like The Clash made this great album called London Calling, and then sort of like they did this other stuff, and they were a great band. And I hate that narrative, because like one of the great things about doing the 70s and watching it is you can see when shit changes. Yeah. And this sounds nothing like stuff that we've done in terms of energy. Yep. It's got elements of, rockabilly, straight ahead pop, even like pop, Beatles, like Big Star, the melody like Matt talks about, Stooges, certainly different stuff like that, right? But there is an Englishness to this sound, and there is a late 70s-ness to this sound that this album absolutely captures, that you are in a different time and place in the 70s from the other music that was being made in the 70s and especially in England, because the English music we're covering, right? This is what really needs to be understood, I think, about the like punk in England, right? It was very much a reaction to like what was being made in the 70s, which was like art rock, prog rock, just real, like overcomplicated, right? Like music that sort of spoke to like kids that went to college, right? And that was the vibe, you know what I mean? That was what it was. And then you had all these working class folks that were in all of these different pods, right? And punk was sort of the first of the things to explode, right? And, we could talk on and on about this because there's other subgenres that come out of this as well, like swing revival and ska and all, and the type of ska that came out was like two-tone, right? You also have to remember there's a huge Jamaican population in London at this time with immigrants that is infusing the reggae sound. You don't get much of it on this album outside of the Police and Thieves cover, but the US version of it, which I sometimes forget, because I heard the US version, I think first when I was 12, and then the UK version later, and I'm like, wow, they have even more great songs. But, just to give you an idea, the US version has like Clash City Rockers and like Complete Control and I Fought the Law. I mean, these are like seminal Clash songs. So they have all of this plus all of those songs theoretically in this Clash mix. This is an incredible album. I understand what you're saying about the sameness, but it's like punk, So it's
it never detracted for me.
Yeah,
I understood
but I get
where
it.
it was coming from.
I get it, and I don't think of it as a negative. But the reason it has that is because these are not virtuoso musicians playing their instruments, right? This is as much about the aesthetic, the feel, the energy, the vibe, right? They're not trying to make King Crimson and Pink Floyd albums, right? To give two examples of right before this that we're going to cover tonight, right? In many ways, everything the Sex Pistols and the Clash and stuff was designed to be different than that type of sound. And I'm not even making a judgment on that. But boy, was it interesting to listen to this album in that context, because it really rams home, what punk was designed to do. Now, there's the American punk that's going on at the same time that has different twists, right? The American punk is much more rooted almost in like 50s and 60s music to some degree, and an offshoot from there, right? If you go with the Ramones and working backwards.
Well, you kind of think of Velvet Underground too. As like a lineage on that side of things.
And they also were influenced by the same 50s and 60s stuff that, was there. So there is a difference between, I think punk gets lumped together, but like American punk and British punk are different. And this album, the Clash are so tight. They're so tight in terms of their transitions. They write incredible hooks. They also write incredible lyrics. I'm not gonna disagree with what Matt's saying because he's getting the energy, but it is important to know that the Clash aren't singing about like the KKK took my baby away and I want to be sedated. The Ramones are charming in their own way, right? But they're largely writing about being kind of a fuck up, taking drugs, stuff like that, right? Now the Clash are writing about like weighty issues in these pop songs, like songs like Career Opportunities, right, are basically these very cynical takes on like the job market, right, for like youths in England at the time, and that would continue to, a good parallel here would be, what the Sex Pistols were singing about and like, God Save the Queen and stuff like that, Anarchy in the UK, and then, later the Specials would come and write a whole album full of songs about the disaffectedness. The Buzzcocks, had that romanticism, but also mixed with a cynical twist, right? It's the first step into that world. I'm really excited about entering that world because I feel like the late 70s, especially that late 70s British music, is really amongst my favorite times in music. I'm almost giddy about covering it, but the rawness of the production is also highly appealing on this album to me. Yeah. The one thing I want to do as a takeaway from this is I want to get people away from this narrative if they want to understand the Clash, that like you listen to London Calling and then you get the Clash. I love London Calling. I love it. But I think people stop there and it's just, it does give them enough rope, as unwieldy as Sandinista can be, right? There's many gems in there as well. We're not even going to cover Combat Rocket album. I think gets unfairly maligned in some things. How bad can an album be that has like Rock the Casbah on it? You know what I mean? There's other songs besides that are incredible, but yeah, just this is an A+ for me. It's impossible for me to be objective about this because this album is in the top 3 in terms of albums that were seminal in terms of me starting the journey that led down about 1,000 other roads to music that defined my palette. This was one of the 3 on-roads. I mean, we'll talk about the others down the road. We're not there yet, but this specific album was one of them. So highest recommend.
Yeah, there's not many. So Matt made a good point where you couldn't necessarily understand what Joe Strummer was saying, and I had that thought too. So then I started reading the lyrics as I was listening to the songs, and it's funny how it like seems obvious when you read the words and like hear what he's saying. It's like, oh, of course he's saying that, but that's just, you know, your brain. But yeah, the let's not underplay like the social issues and kind of the working class point of view. I imagine that they're working class based on what they're saying, and I don't think we've listened to many English bands up to this point that have written about, you know, have lyrics from that point of view or from that. Maybe some people are from that kind of background, but they're not like writing
Black
lyrics
Sabbath.
about it.
I was just thinking Sabbath, but did they write about being working class?
They wrote more like about like magic and and like dark themes. They didn't.
Well, they wrote about what a shitty place, you know.
Yeah.
Was it Manchester? Is that where they're from?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They wrote about like what a shitty place it was to live early on. But
yeah.
Yeah. How many British bands though started met while they were at art school, right? Or at like primary school for like the gifted or so, you know. And I'm not saying that's a negative thing. Great music came out of that, but that's kind of like, you know, the origin story. And this very much is not that.
Right. Like the Who as a contrast, you know, they met in school, right? But then they're, you know, Townsend's trying to make like concept albums and like rock operas, and they just are not like focused on kind of the nitty gritty day-to-day life that these lyrics write about, you know, trying to, you know, speaking to that, you know, you have songs about hate and war. You have songs about, like John said, career opportunities, but also about a condom and Protex Blue. And then 48 Hours, the second to last song, about, you know, making the most of the weekend, essentially, because you have 48 hours before, I think they called Monday is Jail on Wheels, as they said in the song. So,
well, and we haven't even mentioned London's Burning, which is about a 1976 riot, White Riot, ditto, about like a working, because context in England, right? It's also important. I mean, this is the era that leads up to Margaret Thatcher, right? Mm-hmm. With the austerity and the conservative and like the working class, they're in the process of squeezing the unions, right? Inflation is huge in Great Britain. There's so many cultural contexts. There's race issues in Great Britain quite a bit with immigration coming in and working class neighborhoods. There's a lot of like significant class differences. I mean, the Sex Pistols write about that quite a few times, in terms of, especially about the monarchy, right, and ideas like that. But yeah, I mean, that's all being covered here.
Yep.
That's a great point, Josh. So, impossible to think of the Clash without thinking of them as a political band. They are inherently political.
Yeah, and I think I was getting the message there, certainly, if not just from the song titles. But it's not like I couldn't understand anything that they were saying, and I think that's if you're going to compare them to the Ramones, yeah, you're absolutely right. I never thought of it like that before, but yeah, the Ramones are kind of like a bunch of goofballs, and you know, the Clash is kind of like more of a political band, you know, and messaging and talking about social structures and whatnot. So I certainly picked up on that, but what I just was mainly left with was just how energetic and, you know, catchy, and fun and lively and angry in some places. Like his voice, I can't stress it enough. Just like this is the good kind of screaming. You know, I'll complain a lot of times about, you know, some singers that just scream and it's like, you know, it's like this, but that's more of a guttural thing when, you're going to get with some artists that do maybe heavier stuff. But this is great. This is just the energy that he's got here. And the production, I agree. I think you guys were both mentioning this, that that lo-fi production. I mean, this is, God, talk about wanting to see a band in like a really small club with like a brick wall behind them and like this tiny stage where they can barely move, and like there's just, there's just this pit of like maybe 50 people. There's just stuffed in this tiny room like that. That's what I picture. When I hear this, the rawness and intimacy too. So a lot of fun, a lot of energy here, and that's my main takeaway.
I think it's also important to note that the albums that are left off this and added in the U.S. album are also contemporary tracks and are particularly notable for the fact that they integrate more sounds in them. Like White Man and Hammersmith Palace is definitely has like almost like some harmonica in it and a reggae vibe for sure, is incredibly political, all the way down to basically like a rant about right-wing politics at the end of it, right? With ending with Joe Strummer basically saying if Adolf Hitler came back, there'd be like a limousine back these days. Complete Control is about the fact that Remote Control, the album, got released as a single despite the fact they didn't want it to. So they wrote a song called Complete Control where they shit all over their record company. Clash City Rockers is about working class riots. Like it's so much the palette right here, and not that it's not evident here, and Matt even picked it up without even knowing what the words were, the vibe of the album. But like, if you were wondering, the US version of it like throws it into, not only does it throw in the lyrical content, but it also tips the hand a little bit in terms of where they're going to go music palette wise as well. Right. So I would definitely check out the US version of it too, because it's not like they just threw in a couple like shitty bonus tracks. These are like big time tracks that they put in. So yep. All right. Any last thoughts on the Clash before we move on to Seg 2?